In this video, I'll show you step by step how to apply epoxy resin to any project to get that high gloss, glass looking finish. Once you have the piece that you want finished sanded and stained, you're ready to go. The first thing you need to do is turn your piece over and carefully apply painter's tape to the entire outside edge. The purpose of this is to catch any excess drips when you apply the liquid glass resin. You'll see later on in this video why this is a very important step. Once you have the entire outside edge of the bottom side of your project taped, it should look something like this. The next step is to turn your project over and set it on a couple blocks so that the bottom side doesn't touch the surface. Be sure to do this on a clean piece of cardboard because this next step gets messy. We're now going to mix the two-part epoxy that can be purchased at Home Depot, Rona, or any hobby store. The two-part epoxy consists of 1 bottle of resin and 1 bottle of hardener. To mix the epoxy, you'll need 2 plastic containers of equal size. Pour the desired amount of resin into one of the plastic containers and the exact same amount of hardener into the other plastic container. Try to only pour out as much of the liquid as you think you'll need because the epoxy is expensive and a little goes a long way. Now that you have equal parts of resin and hardener poured into 2 separate plastic containers, it's time to mix them. It's not all that important which liquid you dump into the other, but I've found from experience that the resin is a little bit thinner than the hardener and easier to pour. Combine the 2 liquids by pouring one of them into the other. Be sure to scrape the edges of the plastic container to get as much of the liquid out as possible. Once you have the 2 liquids poured together into one container, it's time to start mixing. The mixing process is a very important step. You must mix the 2 liquids together for a full 5 minutes. Once you have the epoxy mixed for the full 5 minutes, you're ready to pour it on your project. There's no right or wrong way to pour out the epoxy onto your project, but I find it best to pour it more into the center of the project and to spread it out later with a foam brush. Now use your foam brush to spread a generous amount of epoxy onto all areas you want covered. Don't worry too much about getting it perfectly even, because in the next step we'll be smoothing it out to give you that liquid glass finish. Once you have the epoxy spread, you're ready for the finishing step. This step is not as hard as you might think. Take a plastic spatula or thin piece of wood and lightly trowel off the top layer of epoxy. Continue to lightly trowel your surface from one side to the other, and remove a thin layer of the epoxy each time. At this point, don't worry if you leave streaks, runs, or drips, because you'll need to repeat this process 3 or 4 or even 5 times until you get that liquid glass finish. I also want to note that your plastic spatula or thin piece of wood does not have to be the entire width of your project. I just happened to use a scrap piece of wood in my demonstration that was. Once you've troweled your project from one side to the other a couple times, you'll notice that the white haze of the epoxy starts to disappear. And this is exactly what you want. Keep troweling the surface of your project until all or almost all of the white haze is gone. It's okay to have small patches of white haze left on your project. I will show you later on in this video how to get rid of them. Once you have your surface lightly troweled just the way you want it, you'll need to take care of all the runs and drips left on the side edges. To take care of the sides, all you need to do is take your foam brush and paint off most of the epoxy. You'll need to keep wiping the edges with your foam brush until all the runs and streaks are gone, as well as the majority of the white haze. Once you're happy with how your project looks, we'll need to get rid of the last of the white haze and any little bubbles that have formed due to the chemical reaction of the hardener and resin. To do this step, you'll need a propane torch. Simply turn your torch on to the lowest setting possible and wave the flame over your project, keeping the flame about 6 inches away. As you're doing this, you'll notice that any of the white haze disappears and any of the little bubble formations will pop. It's very important to keep the flame moving. If you leave the flame in one spot for too long, you will scorch the epoxy. Once you've gone over your entire project with the torch, you'll need to let it sit for about 30 minutes. Once you've let your project sit for 30 minutes, just double check to make sure no other little bubbles have formed. If you've noticed that they have formed, simply take out your torch again and fan it over them like we did before until they pop. Once you're finished using the torch, you will need to let the epoxy harden for at least 24 hours before you touch it. I personally leave my projects for 2 or 3 days. Once you've let your project sit for at least 24 hours, you can pick it up and we're ready for the final step. If you turn your project over, you'll notice that little droplets of epoxy have formed on the painter's tape that we previously put on. Remove as much of the painter's tape and epoxy droplets as you can by hand. And if you have to set your project down, be careful not to set it on anything that will scratch your newly finished top. Once you've removed all the tape, you'll notice many of the little droplets are still stuck to the bottom side of the project. You can pretty much use any item that you want to scrape off the little droplets. I'm using a paint scraper. The trick is just to pick them off one at a time. Just be very careful not to scrape through the painter's tape because you wouldn't want to scratch your project. Once you have finished removing any of the epoxy droplets, take a clean, damp rag and wipe off any of the excess glue from the painter's tape. Once you've given your project a good cleaning, you'll have that professional, liquid glass looking finish. I hope you enjoyed my video and found it useful. If you have any comments, feel free to leave them, and if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask.